The land was quiet except for the restless whisper of the prairie wind. It was that uneasy kind of silence that came before a storm, when even the coyotes went still, and the sky seemed to hold its breath. Down in a lonely valley, tucked between two gray ridges, stood a weathered cabin with smoke rising faintly from its crooked chimney. That cabin belonged to Martha McAdams, a widow hardened by the frontier, and her daughter Clara, who carried both her mother's strength and her late father's gentle heart. Clara McAdams was 21, but carried herself with the calm patience of someone twice her age. Her hands were calloused from chores, her cheeks pale from the cold, and her eyes, large, hazel, and steady, had the soft sadness of someone who had already known loss. Her father had died 2 winters ago, crushed beneath a fallen beam while trying to repair the barn during a storm. Since that day, the ranch had survived through sheer willpower and endless work. Clara milked the cows at dawn, mended fences, traded herbs for flour, and helped her mother care for sick travelers who came through the valley. It wasn't an easy life, but it was theirs. That evening, as twilight bled into a curtain of black clouds, the air began to hum with the promise of rain. Clara stood by the window, sewing the last hem of a shirt when she heard their old hound Rufus start to bark outside. He barked with that deep, urgent tone that meant more than a passing coyote. Something or someone was near. She stepped to the door, lantern in hand. Out on the ridge, framed by a flash of lightning, she saw the silhouette of a horse and rider swaying against the storm. The figure seemed barely conscious, gripping the saddle horn before sliding off into the mud. The horse snorted, panicked, then bolted into the darkness. "Ma!" Clara shouted. "Someone's out there!" Martha came from the kitchen, wiping her hands. "Could be trouble," she warned. "No good comes from strangers after sundown," but Clara was already pulling her shawl over her shoulders. "He's hurt, Ma, look at him." Ignoring her mother's protest, she ran into the wind. The rain came down in sheets, icy and relentless, drenching her dress in moments. She reached the fallen rider and knelt beside him. His face was pale beneath the dirt and blood, his shirt soaked crimson at the shoulder. She pressed her fingers to his neck, a faint pulse. "Hold on," she whispered. "You're gonna be all right." With effort, she half-dragged, half-guided him toward the cabin. Martha met her at the door, her jaw tight with worry but her eyes betraying concern. Together, they laid the man on the spare cot by the fire. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and feverish. Martha examined the wound with grim experience. "Gunshot," she muttered. "Been festering for days. We'll need to clean it before it poisons him." Clara fetched hot water, clean cloths, and what little medicine they had, comfrey leaves, spirits, and a small jar of lard and pine resin. Her hands trembled as she cut away the blood-soaked fabric, revealing a jagged wound on his upper shoulder. The bullet had passed through but left a deep infection. The smell of blood mixed with the sharp sting of spirits filled the small cabin. The man stirred, groaning. "Don't," he mumbled. "They'll find me." Clara's voice was gentle, steady. "Hush, you're safe here." Hours passed. The rain hammered the roof and the fire hissed as droplets leaked through the cracks. Clara didn't sleep. She cleaned the wound again and again, whispering small prayers under her breath. When the fever worsened, she soaked cloths in cold water and pressed them to his brow. Her mother, watching from the shadows, saw the look in her daughter's eyes, that mixture of compassion and quiet fear. By dawn, the storm broke. A faint pink glow stretched across the valley and mist curled low over the grass. Inside the cabin, the man's breathing steadied. When Clara bent to check his bandage, his eyes fluttered open, clear gray eyes that seemed to hold years of dust and regret. "Where am I?" he asked hoarsely. "You're in the McAdams place," Clara said softly. "You were hurt. We found you near the ridge." He blinked, studying her face for a long moment. "You saved me?" She smiled faintly. "You can thank my mother, too. She nearly barred the door when she saw you." A weak chuckle escaped his lips, quickly turning to a cough. "I don't blame her. These days a wounded man could mean bad company." Martha crossed her arms, unimpressed but not unkind. "You're welcome to stay till you're strong enough to ride, but no longer." He nodded, accepting the boundary. "Name's Eli Carter," he said after a moment. "Was working cattle up near Red Mesa before things went bad." Neither woman pressed for details, but the way he said things went bad lingered in the air like smoke. Over the next few days, Eli remained bedridden. Clara tended to him with patient care, changing his bandages, feeding him broth, keeping his fever down. Each night, when he drifted into half-sleep, he would murmur names she didn't recognize and phrases like ambush, stolen herd, and they'll come for me. Clara never asked. She only listened, feeling something deeper than curiosity, a pull, as though she understood the quiet pain beneath his words. On the 5th day, Eli managed to sit by the fire, his arm still in a sling. Clara was sweeping when he said softly, "You could have left me out there." "Most folks would have." She looked up from her work. "My pa wouldn't have. He used to say, when someone's hurt, you help him stand, even if he's a stranger." He smiled faintly. "Then your pa was a good man." "He was," she said, her voice small. "The best there was." A silence settled between them, warm but fragile. Through the window, the plain stretched endlessly, golden in the evening light. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush and rain-washed earth. In the days that followed, Eli began to regain his strength. He helped chop wood with one good arm, insisting on repaying their kindness. Clara tried to protest, but her mother let him work, perhaps sensing that his pride demanded it. In those quiet hours, Clara began to notice the man behind the scars, how he always tipped his hat before speaking, how he paused to listen when she read aloud from her father's old Bible, and how his laughter, rare but genuine, seemed to warm the entire cabin. Yet, for all his gentleness, there was a shadow in Eli's eyes. One morning, while he was outside feeding the chickens, 2 riders appeared at the far end of the path. Clara saw them first, tall men with dusters and revolvers, their horses foaming from a hard ride. "Stay inside," Eli said when he spotted them, his expression changing instantly. The older rider called out, "We're looking for Eli Carter. Heard he's been seen limping around this valley." Clara's pulse quickened. Eli stepped forward. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Finch," the man said, sneering. "You shot my brother near Red Mesa. Man wants justice." Eli's jaw tightened. "Your brother was stealing from the ranch." "I warned him. He drew first. That's not how we heard it." Finch reached for his holster. "You're coming with us." Before the gun cleared leather, a deep, steady voice broke the tension. Martha's. She stood in the doorway, holding her late husband's shotgun. "No man draws a weapon on my land without permission," she said coldly. "You boys best turn those horses around before I forget I was raised Christian." The riders hesitated. They hadn't counted on a woman with steel in her eyes. Finch spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Carter." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving the family in uneasy silence. When they were gone, Clara turned to Eli, her voice trembling. "You said you weren't an outlaw." "I'm not," he said firmly. "But trouble's been on my trail since that day in Red Mesa. I never wanted to bring it here." Clara's throat tightened. "Then you'll leave. When you can ride?" He hesitated, his gray eyes meeting hers with quiet sorrow. "If it keeps you safe, yes." But both knew that something unspoken had already rooted itself between them, something that neither fear nor distance could easily tear away. That night, as the wind whispered through the valley once more, Clara sat by the dying fire, staring at the cot where the wounded cowboy slept. Her heart ached with a new kind of fear, not of danger, but of losing the one person who had made her world feel alive again. Outside, the storm clouds gathered once more, promising that the days ahead would test them both, and that the wound she healed on his body was nothing compared to the one growing quietly in her heart. The days that followed the confrontation with the riders passed with a strange stillness, like the prairie itself was holding its breath. The sky stretched endlessly blue, and the wind that moved through the dry grass carried both peace and unease, a reminder that the frontier was never truly quiet for long. Clara McAdams woke before sunrise as always. She fed the hens, carried water from the well, and set the coffee pot on the stove. When she turned, she saw Eli Carter sitting by the window, his sling gone, his arms stiff but strong again. He had been up before her, mending the fence by moonlight. The man was restless, and though he never said so, she knew why. Guilt. "You'll tear your stitches again if you don't take it slow," she said softly, pouring him coffee. He smiled faintly. "Ain't the stitches that ache, miss. It's the sittin' still." Clara studied him for a moment. There was something different about him that morning, a weight in his eyes, as if the past he'd tried to outrun had finally caught up. She sat down across from him. "Those men who came the other day," she began carefully. "They weren't lying about Red Mesa, were they?" Eli's hand froze halfway to his cup. He lowered it slowly, then sighed. "No, they weren't lying. But they didn't tell the whole story either." He leaned back, staring into the distance as if watching ghosts rise from the horizon. "I used to ride for a rancher named Harland, Fitch, a man mean enough to starve his own men if it made him richer. I was foreman there. I thought I could make a life out of honest work, but Fitch didn't believe in honesty. One night he sent me and a few others to drive a herd across the border, said the owner owed him debt. But it wasn't his herd. We were rustling, and I didn't know till it was too late. The owner found us, guns went off, and one of Fitch's men, Finch's brother, drew on me. I shot back. He paused, jaw tight. Fitch blamed me for it. Said I'd killed his man without cause and ran off with stolen cattle. He sent word through the territory that I was wanted, so I ran. I've been running ever since." Clara listened without interrupting. When he finally met her eyes again, there was no fear in hers, only quiet understanding. "You did what you had to," she said softly. "A man shouldn't hang for protecting himself." Eli's mouth twitched into something like a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The law don't care much for truth out here, only for who shouts louder." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Martha entered just then, wiping her hands on her apron, her sharp eyes taking in the silence between them. She didn't speak, but her look said enough. "Be careful, Clara." Eli sensed it too. "Your mother's right to be wary," he said later, while helping Clara hang laundry behind the cabin. "If trouble finds me again, I'll ride out before it touches either of you." "You'll ride out?" Clara asked quietly, knotting a sheet on the line. He nodded. "That's the only way I know to protect you." She didn't answer right away. The sheet fluttered between them, white in the sunlight like a fragile wall. Then she whispered, "Maybe some things are worth facing instead of running from." Eli looked at her, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. That evening, Clara went down to the creek to fetch water. The air was cool, the sky burning gold and purple. She crouched near the edge, watching her reflection ripple when a shadow fell across the surface. Turning, she saw Eli. He'd followed her quietly, his hat in his hands, eyes uncertain. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You didn't," she replied, but her voice trembled, just enough for both of them to hear it. He knelt beside her, helping lift the heavy bucket. For a moment their hands brushed. Her breath caught and she quickly looked away. "Clara," he began slowly. "Back when I was lying in that bed, I told myself I'd ride out the moment I could stand. But every day I stayed, it got harder to think about leaving." Her heart beat faster. "Why's that?" He smiled faintly. "Because of you. You talk soft, but your heart's strong. Reminds me of something I thought I'd lost." Clara stared at the creek, afraid to meet his eyes. "Don't say that, Eli. You'll only make it harder when you go." "I'm not good at saying the right thing," he murmured. "But I mean every word." The water gurgled between them, carrying their reflection downstream. Two figures drawn together by fate and fear, standing at the edge of something neither fully understood. Back at the cabin, Martha watched from the window, her heart heavy. She'd seen that look before, years ago when she herself was young and brave enough to love a man the world kept trying to break. She wanted to warn her daughter that love, on the frontier, was a dangerous luxury, but when she saw the light in Clara's eyes, she couldn't bring herself to speak. 2 nights later, trouble came again. The moon hung low and red, staining the land in silver fire. Clara had just finished sewing by the lamplight when Rufus began barking furiously outside. Eli grabbed his gun instinctively, moving to the door. "Stay behind me," he said, a voice called out from the dark. "Evening, Carter. Hope you don't mind us stopping by." It was Finch again, and this time, he wasn't alone. 4 men rode with him, their rifles glinting under the moon. Martha blew out the lamp. The cabin plunged into shadow. Eli whispered, "Get down." He peered through the window crack, heart pounding. They mean business this time. Clara clutched his arm. Eli, please, don't fight them here. They'll burn the house down. He looked at her, the fear in her face cutting deeper than any wound. I won't let them hurt you. But before he could act, a gunshot shattered the silence, splintering the doorframe. Rufus barked wildly. Eli fired back, hitting one man's hat clean off his head. The riders scattered for cover behind the corral fence. Inside, Clara and her mother crouched low. Smoke from the gunpowder stung their throats. Another shot tore through the window pane. Eli shouted, "Stay down!" He leaned out, fired twice more, and the sound of galloping hooves followed. Within moments, the night fell silent again, except for Rufus's distant growl and the wind moaning across the valley. Clara rose slowly, trembling. They're gone? For now, Eli said grimly. He holstered his revolver, jaw tight. They'll be back, and next time they'll bring more. Martha touched his arm. Then you best go before they do. You've brought enough danger here already. Eli looked at her, then at Clara, the woman who had pulled him from death and nursed him back to life. Leaving her would be like leaving a part of himself behind. I'll go at first light, he said finally. Clara turned away, her throat tight. She didn't speak another word the rest of the night. Dawn broke soft and cold. Mist hung low over the valley. Eli saddled the horse he'd borrowed from Martha's stable, an old mare named Daisy. Clara stood on the porch, arms folded around herself, watching him prepare to ride. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Yes, I do, he replied. If I stay, they'll come again. If I lead them away, you'll be safe. She stepped closer, eyes glistening. And what about you? He smiled faintly, that worn-out cowboy's smile that hides everything it feels. I've had worse odds. When he swung into the saddle, she reached out and touched his hand. Eli, you once said you owed me your life. Don't repay it by throwing it away. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then pray that I come back, and maybe I will. With that, he nudged the mare forward and rode off into the morning mist, his figure fading like a dream at the edge of the plains. Clara stood there long after he was gone, the wind tugging at her hair, her heart heavy with both fear and faith. She didn't know whether he'd return, only that the wounded stranger who had stumbled into her life had somehow healed something broken inside her too. And though the cabin behind her was silent, she whispered softly into the dawn, Come back, Eli. Please come back. The wind of the open prairie carried both freedom and danger in its breath. It had been 4 days since Eli Carter left the McAdams homestead behind, 4 days since he last saw Clara's face framed by the soft glow of dawn, her eyes silently pleading for him to come back. He had ridden east toward Red Mesa, the place where all his troubles had begun. His arm still ached from the wound Clara had tended so carefully, and though his body was nearly healed, his heart was torn between two forces, duty and love. One demanded that he face his past and clear his name. The other whispered that peace was waiting for him back in that quiet valley, in the arms of the woman who had saved him. But peace, he knew, didn't come easy for men like him. The trail was rough and narrow, carved through red cliffs and thorny brush. By the second night, he reached a small settlement on the outskirts of Red Mesa, Dry Creek, a lawless cluster of shacks and saloons where outlaws and drifters traded whiskey for silence. He tied Daisy to a post outside the Silver Spur Saloon, tipped his hat low and stepped inside. The place smelled of smoke, sweat, and cheap liquor. A piano played a slow tune in the corner, and laughter mingled with the clink of glass. But when Eli entered, the laughter faded. Men turned to look, not because they recognized him, but because they could smell trouble. He walked to the bar. Whiskey, he said. The bartender, a heavy man with a scar down his cheek, poured a shot. Ain't seen you round here before. Been gone a while, Eli replied. I'm looking for Harlan Fitch. The room went quiet. The bartender's hand froze. You sure you want to find him? Folks who do usually end up on the wrong end of his cult. Eli's eyes hardened. I just want to talk. A man at the far table chuckled. A talk with Fitch? Son, The only talk he gives is through bullets. Eli ignored him, finished his drink, and headed for the door. But before he could step outside, the swinging doors creaked open, and a familiar voice filled the room. Well, well. If it ain't Eli Carter, the runaway cowhand. It was Finch, grinning like a vulture. Behind him stood two men with rifles. Eli turned slowly, his hand resting near his holster. Didn't think you'd find me this fast. Finch spat his cigar stub into the dirt. We didn't have to look far. Word travels quick when a wanted man rides into town asking about his boss. Ex-boss, Eli corrected. Finch's grin widened. Won't matter soon. Eli didn't move, didn't blink. He knew what was coming. When Finch's hand twitched toward his gun, Eli's Colt cleared leather first. The crack of the shot split the air like thunder. Finch's revolver flew from his grip, spinning across the floor. Next man who draws dies where he stands, Eli warned. No one moved. Eli backed toward the door, gun steady. Tell Fitch I'm coming for him. And this time, I ain't running. He stepped into the night and vanished down the dusty street before anyone dared breathe again. He rode through the darkness until the first pale light of dawn touched the cliffs. In the distance, the mesas rose like giant sentinels, red and solemn under the morning sky. Somewhere beyond those rocks was Harlan Fitch's ranch, the empire built on blood and lies. Eli camped near a dry wash, eating cold beans from a tin. He thought of Clara, her quiet smile, her hands tending his wounds, the way she had looked at him like he was worth saving. That memory burned in his chest brighter than any fire. I'll come back, he murmured to the wind, soon as this is done. But the road ahead was far from merciful. By noon, Eli reached the canyon trail that led to Fitch's spread. He tied Daisy among the rocks and crept closer on foot. From the ridge, he saw it. A sprawling ranch house surrounded by corrals, guards, and smoke from the forge. Fitch had grown richer, it seemed, and more paranoid. Eli's plan was simple. Find proof of Fitch's rustling, confront him, and force a confession. But fate, as usual, had its own plans. A shout rose behind him. You there, stop! Eli spun around, two armed riders. He fired once, ducked behind a rock, and ran down the ravine. Bullets whistled past his head. He darted through a dry creek bed, slipping between the boulders until he found a narrow cave. Inside, he waited, breathing hard. The riders searched a while before galloping off, their curses fading in the distance. When silence returned, Eli sank to his knees, exhausted. He pressed a hand to his shoulder, not bleeding, just throbbing from strain. Damn fools, he muttered. Almost had me. As he rested, his mind drifted back to Clara again. He could almost hear her voice, soft but steady. Maybe some things are worth facing instead of running from. That thought gave him strength. He rose, brushed the dust from his coat, and headed back toward the ranch under cover of dusk. By the time the sun sank, Eli had slipped into the ranch yard unseen. He hid behind a wagon near the barn and watched as Fitch himself stepped out of the house, tall, gray-haired, and dressed in fine clothes far above his kind. A cruel smile twisted his lips as he spoke to a man beside him. Make sure the Carter fella's body gets buried deep when you find him, Fitch said. Can't have him turning up before the marshal gets here. The other man nodded and walked off. Eli's blood boiled. He stepped out of the shadows, cocking his revolver. No need to look far, Fitch. Fitch froze. Slowly, he turned. Well, well, the ghost himself. I wondered when you'd crawl back out of the desert. You framed me, Eli said. You sent me on that Russell job, then pinned the killing on me. Why? Fitch shrugged. Because you were a fool who wouldn't play along. You had the men's respect, and I couldn't have that. Out here, power's worth more than truth. You killed your own man for it. Fitch smiled coldly. Ain't the first, won't be the last. Eli's finger tightened on the trigger. For a moment, revenge burned like wildfire in his chest. But Clara's voice echoed again in his memory. Don't repay life by throwing it away. He took a slow breath. No, Fitch, I ain't hanging for your sins. The marshal will hear this from your own mouth, Fitch laughed. You think anyone will believe you over me? Eli didn't answer. Instead, he turned slightly, signaling toward the gate. Out from behind the barn stepped two lawmen, rifles raised. I figured you'd say that, Eli said. So I brought witnesses. The marshal, a grizzled man with a gray beard, stepped forward. We heard everything, Fitch. You're done. Fitch's eyes widened, fury flashing across his face. He reached for his gun, But before he could draw, the marshal fired. The echo rolled across the canyon, final and cold. Eli stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the man who had haunted his life lying still in the dirt. He felt no triumph, only quiet exhaustion. The marshal lowered his rifle. "You're free, Carter. Reckon you've earned some peace." Eli nodded slowly. "Peace, yeah. Maybe now I can find it." That night he camped alone on the ridge, the stars blazing above him like silver fire. The air was cold and still, carrying only the whisper of the desert wind. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking of Clara, the girl who had pulled him from death, who had seen worth in a man long thought lost. For the first time in years, Eli felt something lift off his shoulders, the weight of guilt, the burden of running. His name was clean again, but his heart? That still belonged to the valley he'd left behind. "I'm coming home, Clara," he whispered into the night. "I'm coming back." At dawn, he saddled Daisy and turned west toward the McAdams homestead. The journey would take days, but the thought of her waiting at the porch was enough to carry him through every mile. The rising sun bathed the plains in gold, and for the first time in a long time, Eli Carter rode not as a fugitive, but as a man redeemed. The wind had changed. For days, clouds gathered above the ridge, rolling in heavy gray folds like restless spirits. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Down in the valley, the McAdams homestead stood calm but tense, fences mended, doors reinforced, and every lantern filled with oil. Clara knew something was coming. She could feel it the way the earth feels thunder before it strikes, and though Eli's shoulder had healed enough for him to lift a saddle again, he carried a weariness that no medicine could cure. A dread born not from pain, but from knowing the past was circling back. It had been 2 weeks since the last gunfire. Reddick's men hadn't returned, but neither had they given up. Eli had seen tracks near the creek, too fresh, too careful. He hadn't told Clara at first, but she had sensed his unease anyway. That morning, as the sky darkened, Clara found him by the corral, tightening his horse's cinch. His jaw was set, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You're not leaving again, are you?" she asked quietly. He turned, meeting her eyes. For a moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy as the coming storm. "I ain't got much choice, Clara. If I stay, they'll find me here. And if they find me here," she stepped closer, "then we face them together. You said yourself this place gave you a reason to keep fighting." He exhaled slowly. "I did, but I won't make your home a battleground." Her hands tightened around the fabric of her apron. "You think this is just your fight, Eli, but it's not. When you came here, you became part of this life, part of us." He froze. The word us hit him harder than any bullet ever could. He looked down at her, at the courage blazing behind her soft eyes. For the first time, he reached out and brushed his fingers against hers. "I never wanted to feel this way again," he murmured, "but I reckon I'd die protecting you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. "Then don't die. Live on Irna with me. That's how you protect me." The moment hung fragile between them like a promise unspoken yet already sealed. That night, thunder rumbled low across the plains. Rain began to fall, and slow at first, then faster, drumming against the roof and windows. Martha McAdams sat by the fire, mending a torn sleeve, pretending not to notice the glances her daughter and Eli exchanged. She had watched their bond grow, though she never said a word about it. The woman had lived long enough to know that love was both the sweetest blessing and the cruelest danger on the frontier. When the lightning flashed, Eli rose from his chair, peering out the window. His instincts were sharp again, alert. "They're out there," he said under his breath. Clara's heart tightened. "You saw them?" He nodded. 2 riders, maybe more. They're keeping their distance, waiting for the rain to cover their tracks." Martha stood, setting her sewing aside. "Then we don't wait. You two get ready." Within minutes, the cabin turned from a home into a small fortress. Windows were shuttered, rifles loaded, lanterns dimmed. Eli positioned himself near the door, revolver drawn. Clara, trembling but determined, held the spare rifle her father had once used. Her mother took her place near the back window. The rain grew louder, pounding the roof like fists. Lightning flashed again, and in that split second of brightness, Eli saw them. 3 riders moving fast through the downpour, faces shadowed, guns glinting. "They're coming," he shouted. The next moments exploded in chaos. Gunfire cracking through the night, glass shattering, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Eli fired from the doorway, taking cover behind the frame. Clara dropped to her knees beside the hearth, reloading as fast as her trembling hands would allow. Martha fired once through the back window, hitting one of the attackers square in the shoulder. The man's cry was lost in the thunder, then silence. For a heartbeat, only rain. Eli stepped out cautiously into the mud, scanning the yard. 2 of the men were gone, their horses retreating into the darkness. The third lay sprawled near the gate, motionless. He turned back toward the cabin, and that's when he saw it. Smoke. A lantern had fallen during the fight, shattering near the curtains. Flames licked the wall, spreading fast. "Clara!" he shouted, running inside. She and her mother were already trying to smother the flames with wet blankets, but the fire climbed quick. Greedy for air, Eli grabbed the water bucket, dousing it, but the smoke thickened, choking them. "Out!" he coughed. "Get outside, now!" Clara hesitated, eyes watering. "The rifle, forget it," he said, pulling her toward the door. They stumbled out into the storm, rain soaking their clothes. The flames roared behind them, lighting the night in orange and gold. Eli turned back once, watching the home that had saved his life begin to collapse. Martha dropped to her knees in the mud, tears streaming down her face. All we had. Gone. Eli's throat tightened. Guilt tore through him like a blade. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This was my doing." Clara turned to him, her face pale but fierce. "No, you didn't do this. Evil did. And we're still standing." He looked at her. Rain dripping from her hair, her hands trembling, yet her spirit unbroken. In that moment, something inside him shifted forever. He took her hand, his voice hoarse. "I swear to you, Clara, this ends tonight. No more running. No more fear." She squeezed his hand. "Then I'll stand beside you." Martha wanted to protest, but when she saw the look in her daughter's eyes, the same stubborn courage her late husband once had, she said nothing. By dawn, the fire had burned out, leaving only smoke and ash, but Eli didn't stop moving. He followed the tracks in the mud leading north toward the ridge. Clara followed him despite his protests, rifle in hand, her boots sinking into the wet earth. At the top of the ridge, the final confrontation awaited. Reddick himself, tall, broad, with a scar down his cheek, stood by a black horse, revolver drawn. "Well, Carter," he sneered, "you sure picked yourself a fine hideout. Too bad it cost the lady her home." Eli raised his gun. "You've been running from the truth long enough, Reddick. Time to answer for what you did." The air crackled with tension. Rain hissed on hot iron. Clara stood behind Eli, heart pounding. Then came the gunfire, fast, brutal, final. Reddick's first shot grazed Eli's arm, but Eli's return fire struck true. Reddick staggered, eyes wide, before collapsing in the mud. Silence followed, heavy, endless. The storm began to fade, the rain softening into mist. Eli turned to Clara, his body trembling from exhaustion. "It's over." She dropped her rifle, rushing to him. Her hands cupped his face as tears mingled with the rain. "You came back to me," she whispered. He nodded weakly, a faint smile breaking through. "Told you I would." As the first light of morning broke through the clouds, Clara leaned against him, the valley below washed clean by rain and fire. Behind them lay ashes. Before them stretched a future uncertain but alive. Martha, standing a few paces away, watched in silence. Her eyes were tired, but her heart, long guarded, softened at last. When Eli looked at Clara again, he spoke with quiet certainty. "I can rebuild what was lost. Not just the cabin, but a life worth staying for. If you'll have me." She smiled through her tears. "You already know my answer." And there, beneath the fading storm, with the ashes of the past cooling behind them, a promise was made, not just of love, but of renewal. The cowboy who had once carried only scars now carried something far stronger, a reason to stay. The days after the fire were long, silent, and heavy with loss. The McAdams homestead, the cabin that had sheltered laughter, tears, and prayers, was nothing more than a blackened skeleton. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and wet ash, and every step through the ruins stirred ghosts of the life that had been. Clara stood amid the wreckage, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The morning sun, pale and thin, broke through a veil of mist, casting light on the scorched remains of her family's home. Beside her stood Eli Carter, hat in hand, his expression solemn but resolute. His bandaged arm rested in a sling, yet his other hand held a hammer. the first symbol of what was to come. "It can be built again," he said quietly. Clara turned to him, her eyes soft but uncertain. "It won't be the same." "No," Eli replied, gazing at the horizon. "It won't, but maybe it can be better." Those words, simple, steady, spoken from a heart that had known too much wandering, became the seed of hope she needed. From that morning on, they began the slow, backbreaking work of rebuilding not only the house but their lives. The first weeks were the hardest. With the tools they salvaged and wood brought down from the ridge, Eli worked from dawn to dusk, his shoulder aching but his will unbroken. Clara and her mother gathered supplies from kind neighbors who came from miles away when they heard what had happened. One old rancher, a friend of Clara's late father, arrived with a wagon of lumber and said, "Your pa helped me once, years back. I reckon it's time I repaid that debt." Clara's throat tightened as she thanked him. In a land as wild and harsh as theirs, kindness was rare. But when it came, it was as solid as oak. Each day brought progress. The sound of Eli's hammer echoed across the valley, mingling with the rustle of wind through the grass. Sometimes when the sun dipped low, Clara would bring him water and stand beside him, watching the new walls rise where ashes once lay. She noticed how carefully he worked, how every nail, every plank seemed to carry not just labor, but intention. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was building something sacred. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in gold and violet, Eli paused, leaning on the handle of his hammer. "When I was riding from place to place," he said, "I used to think a man's worth came from what he could leave behind. Cattle, money, reputation. But now I think it's about what and who he stands for." Clara smiled softly. "And what do you stand for now, Eli Carter?" He looked at her, really looked, the firelight catching in his gray eyes. "For you," he said simply. Her heart skipped. For a moment she couldn't speak. All the fear, all the pain of the past months seemed to melt away in that single sentence. By midsummer, the cabin was finished, smaller than before but sturdier, warmer, and filled with the scent of pine and new beginnings. The day they placed the final beam, Martha McAdams insisted they hold a small supper to bless it. Neighbors brought bread, stew, and music. Someone played a fiddle and laughter, long absent from the valley and returned like birds to spring. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, her hair tied with a ribbon. Eli, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt for the first time in months, couldn't take his eyes off her. When the music slowed, he asked quietly, "Would you dance with me, Clara?" She hesitated, glancing at the others, but the warmth in his eyes erased her shyness. They stepped into the open yard under lantern light and began to sway. The tune was slow, almost mournful, but their movements carried something tender and unspoken. Martha watched from the porch, her hands folded in her lap, tears glistening in her eyes. She saw in them not the sorrow of what was lost, but the miracle of what had survived. When the last note faded, Eli and Clara stood close, the world around them dissolving into silence. He whispered, "I used to believe a man like me didn't deserve peace, but when I look at you, I start thinking maybe peace was waiting for me all along." Clara rested her head on his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. And maybe love was waiting too. As the months turned, their bond deepened. Eli became more than a guest, more than a protector. He became part of the land itself. Together, he and Clara planted a garden where the ashes had cooled, rows of corn and beans stretching beneath the sun. Each sprout that broke the soil felt like a small promise fulfilled. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, he'd sit with her by the stream and tell her about his past, the ranches he'd worked on, the trails he'd ridden, the faces he'd left behind. She never judged him, only listened, her hand resting gently over his. And when the autumn winds began to stir, he finally spoke the words he'd carried for months. "Clara," he said, standing by the fence as the sun set behind him, "I've been a fool most of my life, running from things that might have made me better. But with you I stopped running. You gave me more than a home. You gave me a reason to belong. If you'd have me, I'd like to make that belonging official." Clara's breath caught. "Are you asking me to?" He smiled shyly, pulling a small silver band from his pocket, one he'd traded for in town with the last of his wages. "Marry me, Clara McAdams." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Eli, 1,000 times yes." Martha, who had been listening from the doorway, wiped her eyes and laughed softly. "Well, it's about time," she said. "Your father would have liked him." The wedding was simple, just a few friends, a minister from the nearby town, and the wide blue sky as witness. Clara wore a dress her mother had kept folded since her own wedding day. Eli wore his best shirt and the same weathered hat he'd ridden into their lives with. When they exchanged vows, Clara's voice trembled. "I once thought love was something that came easy, but I learned it's something you build like a home. Piece by piece, with care." Eli's hand tightened around hers. "And I once thought I had nothing left to give. Turns out all I needed was someone to give it to." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the valley seemed to exhale, as if even the wind approved. Years passed, and the little cabin became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and new life. They had a son whom they named Samuel, after Clara's father. The boy grew up with his mother's courage and his father's steady eyes. Eli taught him to ride, to mend fences, to listen to the wind. Clara taught him kindness, that true strength came not from a gun or a fist, but from compassion. Sometimes at night, when the fire burned low, Eli would look across the room at Clara and think of that first storm, the one that brought him wounded to her door. He would smile and whisper, "Funny thing about storms. You think they come to destroy you, but sometimes they bring you where you belong." Clara, half asleep, would smile back, "And sometimes they bring love." Many years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop by the Carter homestead. They'd see a strong cabin, neat fields, and a woman with hazel eyes standing on the porch while a gray-haired cowboy worked beside her. Folks said they carried an air of peace about them, the kind that comes only to people who have lived through fire and still found light. And when asked about their story, Eli would just tip his hat and say, "It all started with a storm." And a woman who didn't turn away from a stranger. Thus ended their story, not with tragedy but with quiet grace. A widow's daughter who healed a wounded cowboy, and a cowboy who repaid her not with words but with a life built in love and loyalty. Beneath that wide, eternal western sky, they found what the world so rarely grants: peace after pain, home after hardship, and love after all the storms.